I'm turning 40 years old this year, so I thought it would be fun to look at the best 40 books of the last 40 years based on what I've read, one for each year that I've been alive. Now, the interesting thing about this is there were actually some years where I had never read anything that was published in that year, and then it would be followed by a year where I'd maybe read 6 or 7 books that had been published that year, and it was really hard to narrow down of those 6 or 7, which one was my favorite from that year. In the instance where there was a year where I didn't read anything that's been published from that year, I'm going to just put in something that I have in my collection that I want to read. And another note about this is with translations, I tried to go with the original publication date. I just went on what Storygraph said was the original publication date when I sorted this data. So if some of these dates are off, feel free to let me know in the comments, but I didn't confirm a lot of this stuff. I'm just going off what was there. All right, let me get these out of the way and then we'll go over the books. In case you weren't able to do the math on your own, the first year is 1985, and the 80s were a great decade for literature in general. In fact, I did a whole video about the 80s. You can go check that out. And with 1985, there were some great books to choose from. Blood Meridian came out in 1985. Lonesome Dove came out in 1985. But my personal pick is White Noise by Don DeLillo. And DeLillo is considered like one of the greatest American writers, at least one of the greatest living American writers. And although he often gets lumped into kind of the same type of category as like Thomas Pynchon or people who might like David Foster Wallace, I think White Noise is a very approachable book. So if you're intimidated by DeLillo, don't be going into this. What I loved about it is how funny it is, but it was also way ahead of its time. DeLillo really could see the way that our society and culture were going, and reading this after COVID was really just kind of a mind-blowing experience, because in this book, it's kind of about like a disaster where there's an oil spill or chemical spill rather, and just how our infrastructure and our media handles that kind of thing. So really a fun book. Also, the movie adaptation on this one, not great. For 1986, I have a nonfiction. There's a few nonfiction books on this list. I used to read nonfiction almost exclusively. These days, I am reading a lot more fiction. But this is The Drowned and the Saved by Primo Levi. It's translated from Italian by, should have looked this up ahead of time, Raymond Rosenthal. So Primo Levi was an Italian Jew and Holocaust survivor, and one of my favorite books is by him. It's called If This Is a Man / The Truce, and those two books were written within a decade of the end of the Second World War. And so it was a memoir about his time at Auschwitz, and it's a very fresh memory for him at that point in time. The Drowned and the Saved, published in the 80s, had a lot more space for him to reflect, and it also kind of deals with how the current culture in the 80s was thinking about the Holocaust and World War II. And of course, you always have those people thinking like, oh, it was so long ago now, we need to move on. And Primo Levi was having none of it. He was an incredibly intelligent person and a fantastic writer. I've only read his nonfiction. He has written some fiction as well that I definitely need to get to. I probably wouldn't start with this. If you haven't read any Levi, I would go with If This Is a Man, but this was a solid book. I mean, you can see how much I flagged it. All right, a bit of an interesting situation for 87, 88, and 89. According to my Storygraph data, I haven't read any books published from those years. There's a little bit of a caveat to that. I really only started tracking my reading when I started my Bookstagram account, which was like 2023, I think. So there's probably a lot of books that just aren't logged in my Storygraph. But I'm just going to assume that I haven't read anything from there. I didn't want to try to rack my brain and figure out what that was. So these are 3 books that I would love to read. The first one is The Sorrow of War by Bao Nin. This is a vintage red spine edition, which we actually can't get in the US. So my friend Carl over at Please Read Your Book sent this to me. So go check out his channel. This is about the Vietnam War. It's told by someone who lived through it, a Vietnamese citizen who lived through it. Here in the States, we have plenty to choose from when it comes from the American soldier perspective on Vietnam War stuff, but I have yet to read anything from somebody who lived through it from the Vietnamese perspective. And I've read about 7 or 8 Vietnam War related books at this point, so I really need to get to this soon. For 1988, we have another DeLillo, and this is Libra, And this is a kind of a reimagining or retelling of the JFK assassination, and it really digs deep on Lee Harvey Oswald. I've heard this is a pretty polarizing book. I know some readers who really loved it. I know others who were kind of about it. But either way, it sounds like something that's right up my alley, and I don't think there's any denying that DeLillo was on a tear in the 80s. And for 1989, The Melancholy of Resistance by Laszlo Krasznahorkai, who is a Hungarian author. This was translated from the Hungarian by George Zertes. Hopefully I'm saying that right. Krasznahorkai is a very well-renowned Hungarian author. I've yet to read any of his books. I'll probably start with this one because I've heard it's great, and it's a little bit on the shorter side for some of his work. Some of his books are quite long. But yeah, apparently I haven't read anything from 1989, so this is going to be my choice. Okay, 1990 is a fun one because this book was the basis for one of my favorite films, which is Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. I'm sure you're probably all at least familiar with what Jurassic Park is about. What I will say is that this is one of the rare instances where I think the film rivals or is perhaps a little bit even better than the book. But with that said, the book is excellent. There are some key differences. In the movie, obviously, it's very action-packed because we have dinosaurs on screen, but some of the characters are a little bit more friendly or campy in the film, where the book is a little bit darker. Like the grandfather in the movie is like this kind of gentle and kind old man who's just misguided, and he's a little bit more of like a classical villain in Jurassic Park the book. I loved both. If you haven't read this, I would highly recommend it. I think it's the type of book that anyone can read and enjoy regardless of what you typically like to read. For 1991, we're going with some Chinese literature. This is Golden Age by Wang Xiaobo, and this is translated from Chinese by Yan Yan. And I would put this in the good but not great category for myself. I didn't have a lot to choose from this year. I read this actually in 2025, and I think that you probably need a little bit of understanding about Chinese culture and history to really appreciate this one. It's a very satirical criticism of Mao's communist China, in particular the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution, which I know a little bit about, certainly more than the average American, but I'm by no means an expert. One thing that did really surprise me when I started reading Chinese literature is just how funny and satirical it is. I don't know why I didn't expect that, but it's pretty common in a lot of the Chinese lit books that I've read at this point. For my 1992 pick, I don't have a physical copy, but it's a YA novel called Tunes for Bears to Dance To by Robert Cormier, who was my favorite author when I was a young adult. And despite being YA stuff, he packed a lot of serious and adult themes into the books, things that you probably couldn't get away with today. But Tunes for Bears to Dance To is more of a novella. It was pretty short, and it was about this kid that works at, I think, a grocery store, and he works with this older gentleman who was a Holocaust survivor. And he follows this guy to this workshop where he's like building a model of his town, I guess. It's been a while since I've read this book, but I do remember really enjoying it. And then the kid kind of gets blackmailed into smashing this guy's building into bits, and kind of the moral conundrum that he's pushed into in this situation by somebody else. There's a lot more to it than that. I don't want to spoil too much of the book for you either, but honestly, it's a book that I still think about from time to time, and I probably should reread it as an adult, and I think adults could probably read it and appreciate it, even though it's YA. Okay, my pick for 1993, I think this is the first Nobel Prize winner on the list so far, and this is Death in the Andes by Mario Vargas Llosa, who is a famous Peruvian author. This was translated from Spanish by Edith Grossman, and this is far from Llosa's most famous works. He's known for Conversation in the Cathedral and Feast of the Goat and The War at the End of the World. I picked this one up because I thought the cover looked cool, and I hadn't read anything by him. But this does feature his kind of classic dialogue style, which he's known for, which is a little bit hard to explain, but once you read it, you'll get it. But basically what he does is he'll have two characters in the story talking to one another, and one character will be telling a story to another character that happened in the past. And in the story, there are multiple characters who are having dialogue with one another. And then in the midst of that story being told, one of the participants of the conversation in real time is then interjecting dialogue and asking questions about the dialogue that's happening in the story being told. I know it sounds like a lot, but it's actually really cool, and he does it really well. Death in the Andes is about an inspector or detective that is trying to solve some missing persons cases and some murders in the Andes Mountains in a very remote region. There are some really graphic and violent parts of this book, but it's also very funny at times, and definitely got me excited to read more from this author. I actually didn't have anything from 1994 on the list to choose from, so here's another book that I would like to read. This is Thank You for Smoking by Christopher Buckley. My podcast co-host Andy is a big fan of this one. It's a very funny book from what I understand, and it kind of follows the story of a tobacco lobbyist. If you know me or you've watched my videos for a while, my 1995 pick will not surprise you in the least. It's The Tunnel by William Gass. Now, The Tunnel is not even my favorite William Gass novel. It might be my third favorite, but it's still an incredible book. So dark and bleak, challenging to read. You get an incredible sense of accomplishment after you finish reading it. And it's got the classic William Gass prose in it, very lyrical and thematically very dense as well. Couldn't not choose this for my 1995 pick. It is a fantastic book, and it deserves a reread from me because I'm sure there's a lot that I missed. My 1996 pick will probably also not surprise anyone. It's Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. I'm not going to go too much into why I put this on today's list. I literally just did a whole video about what makes this book great. You can go check it out. But what I'll say is, how could you not pick it for 96? I'm sure there's a lot of great books that came out this year, but this is a landmark work in literature, I believe. My 97 pick is a nonfiction. It's probably one of the most impactful books I've ever read, but it is difficult to talk about just because of the subject matter. It's The Rape of Nanking by Iris Chang. The Nanking Massacre happened right around the start of World War II when Japan invaded China and brutally murdered thousands of people. And then Iris Chang wrote a book about what happened. So this is chock full of really hard to look at photographs of the event. It's just a really brutal moment in history. What's interesting about this is the Japanese government, I don't know if they still refuse to acknowledge it, but for a long time they were saying, oh, that didn't really actually happen. And randomly in a used bookstore, I stumbled across this book that basically the Japanese government put out as a rebuttal, saying like, oh, this didn't really go down the way people say that it did. I have it. I haven't read it, but I think it's just a kind of interesting piece of cultural history to show how far governments are willing to go to spread propaganda. Okay, for 98, I actually had a few books to choose from, including The Savage Detectives by Roberto Bolaño, which I didn't love. So I'd rather talk about a book from 98 that I would actually like to read, and also written in Spanish. This is the Dirty Havana trilogy by Pedro Juan Gutierrez and translated by Natasha Wimmer, who is a quite well-known translator, actually. And so this book is interesting because I got it at Gray Matter Books in Hadley, Mass. If you're ever in Massachusetts, make the trip out there. It's worth it, even if it's not super close to you. It's one of my favorite used bookstores. And every summer, they have a big sale. I think it's like 25 or 30% off. And I go in there and I just look at what they got and pick out stuff that sounds interesting, maybe Google it just to see what it's about. This caught my eye, had some interesting reviews on it, and it was $6. That's the sticker price there they wrote on the first page, and it's in beautiful condition for being a used book. So with the discount, I paid less than $6 for this thing. I actually still don't even really know what this is about, but yeah, I thought it sounded cool. So if you've read this, Drop your comments on it below. I'd be curious to hear what you thought of it. For $19.99, I actually thought I would pick a book that I'm about to read. So this is going to be our September book club read for our book club. If you're interested in joining the club, the link is down below. It's a fantastic experience. We have a Discord server where we talk about the books that we read, and then weekly, every single week, we actually have a live streamed meeting where we all call in and chat about the book with each other. And if people can't make the meetings, we record them so you can watch them after the fact. But anyway, this is Flowers of Mold by Ha Seong-nan, and this is translated by Janet Hong, I believe. Yes, translated from Korean by Janet Hong. This is a short story collection. If you're watching this video in August, you can go over to Open Letters website and get a discount on this book for their Women in Translation Month. This is, from what I understand, a collection of short stories that is very haunting and dark, so I'm really excited to read this one. My pick for the year 2000 is a little bit different than some of these other books on here, because this is actually a retelling or reimagining of A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens from the perspective of Sidney Carton. This is A Far Better Rest by Suzanne Allen. And if you're not familiar with A Tale of Two Cities, Sidney Carton's just one of the characters. So he's not the protagonist or main character. So this is told from his perspective. If you don't like Dickens's writing, you'll probably still enjoy this, because this is nothing like Dickens's writing. But this book is a ton of fun. I think I found out about it from a Wikipedia page. I had just read A Tale of Two Cities years ago and was just poking around the internet, reading some reviews, reading some different information about it, and just saw this mentioned, I think, on Wiki. And it sounded cool, bought it, and loved it. My pick for 2001, there's a few very interesting stories I want to tell you about this book. It's a nonfiction about the Korean War. It's called The Bridge at No Gun Ri. It has credited with 3 authors, if you will. It's kind of a research and journalistic project. Charles Hanley, Song Hun Cho, and Martha Mendoza. And this is interesting for a few reasons, because the publication date on this was September 6th, 2001. So only a few days later, obviously one of the most tragic events in American history happened, which completely overshadowed the publication of this book. And this book is about the Korean War, which is known as the Forgotten War, because not a lot of people learn about it or hear about it in American education, because it's sandwiched between World War II and the Vietnam War. And so this incredible work of journalism, this very important book about American history and Korean history, was just totally missed because of what was happening. The book tour for it was canceled. And so when you have a book that's about an event that was already 50 years old, and then this other more recent thing happens, nobody cared, and which is really unfortunate. So if you're not familiar with what happened in the Korean War, basically after World War II, there were American forces stationed in Korea, and there were Soviet forces stationed in Korea in the south and the north parts of the country, respectively. Obviously, each superpower wanted to have its influence on the region, and so it kind of got split into 2 factions, and then a war broke out. We were supposed to be protecting any Koreans who wanted to come to the South and be part of that part of the country, and we ended up killing a bunch of them, unfortunately, and that's effectively what this book is about. It's also a really relevant book to me in my kind of trajectory as an influencer, because when I did a review of this book on Instagram, I think it was my first ever video to crack 100,000 views. And it's a book that nobody ever really talks about an event that nobody ever talks about. And so it kind of really proved to me, much like Hard Rain Falling had done, and I talk about this a lot as well, it proved to me that you don't need to be talking about popular books or trending books to have success on social media. You can really craft interesting stories about whatever books you want, and as long as the content itself is engaging and you frame it in a way that gets people's attention and gets their interest, you can talk about any books that you want. To this day, this book has one of the most grotesque descriptions of something that happened that was so hard for me to read. I literally had to put the book down. and I still think of it from time to time, and it makes my skin crawl. For 2002, I have another book that you can go over to Open Letters website and get a discount on if you're watching this in the month of August. This is To Hell with Kronia by Ingrid Winterbach, and this was translated from Afrikaans by Elsa Silke. And Ingrid Winterbach is a South African author. And this is about a soldier in the Boer War, I think the Second Boer War. And it's kind of a ghost story slash, I don't know. It's a very weird book. It has some of the most beautiful writing in it. It also has some of the most challenging writing for an English speaker because some of the Dutch names of people and places make it a little bit challenging at times. I really didn't know what to make of this book, but it was definitely an experience, and I think about it all the time. It's effectively about this soldier in the Boer War who's gone AWOL after his wife passes away. Got a cool cover. It's an interesting story. I don't regret reading it by any means, but there were some parts of it that blew me away and some parts that left me scratching my head. 2003. Apparently I haven't read anything from then, according to my story graph, so I just went with one that I would like to read. I also picked this up kind of blindly at Grey Matter Books in Hadley, Mass, and this is The Fortress of Solitude by Jonathan Lethem, and this is considered like a great New York City novel. I really don't know much about it other than that. I thought the cover was cool. So if you've read this one, drop a comment about what it's all about and whether it's worth it or not. For 2004, I have one of my all-time favorite books, and this is War Trash by Ha Jin. And Ha Jin is a Chinese-American author. He was born in China, raised in China. I don't think he moved to the States until he was in his 20s. I think he came here for college, and despite having lived in China for so long, in fact, I think he was even part of like the Chinese youth communist thing. He writes in English. He's a professor at Boston University. This is a fictionalized memoir about a Chinese soldier fighting for the North Koreans during the Korean War, who then gets captured, and it's about his time in internment. Very brutal, very sad, but also, again, quite funny. And I've yet to read anything else from Ha Jin, but this book is like a top 10 all-timer for me. For 2005, I have Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is the only Ishiguro I've read, although I have a couple of his other books that I would like to get to at some point. And I know this is a very polarizing book. It's an extremely slow burn, which I like when it's done well, and I think this one is. You could probably consider it a soft sci-fi as well, but effectively it's about some kids at a boarding school or a private school, but something's a little bit amiss. And I really don't want to say much more than that. For 2006, I had 2 books logged on Storygraph, but I didn't love either of them, so I'd rather talk about a book that I would like to read, and this is Against the Day by Thomas Pynchon. This is probably one of Pynchon's more polarizing works in terms of there are people who think that it's great, and there are those who think that, in the 2000s, later in Pynchon's career, he kind of fell off a little bit. But of all of his books, to be honest, the premise of this one sounds the most interesting to me. And I actually love the cover on this. It might be hard to see, but it's like the perspective from a cockpit of a plane bearing down on a city. So this is a beast, though. This is over 1,000 pages, and Pynchon's a pretty tough read, even for some of his easier works. So I'm not sure when I'll get to this one. I definitely need to have a little bit more of a clear plate on my reading schedule than I do at the moment. For 2007, I have a National Book Award winner. This is Tree of Smoke by Dennis Johnson. And this is technically about the Vietnam War, although it's told a little bit more from the perspective of a CIA agent. And this kind of reads like Thomas Pynchon light, in my opinion, which is funny because that's not exactly what Dennis Johnson is known for. He often gets compared to like a more modern Hemingway. This has a really funny Goodreads review, I believe, where the reviewer was not happy with this book, and they went and used this article about like how to win a National Book Award, and then takes pieces from this book and explains how it checks almost every box, kind of insinuating that Dennis Johnson like wrote it with the intention of trying to win this award, and then because of that it kind of just feels a little bit synthetic, I guess. That was not my experience with it. I really enjoyed it, but I don't know, I guess it's not for everyone. For 2008, I chose City of Thieves by David Benioff. He was actually one of the show writers for Game of Thrones, and this is a historical fiction. I think it's loosely based on his grandfather's real life, about some soldiers for the Russian army during World War II, during the siege of Leningrad, I believe. Basically, they're tasked with finding some eggs for their commander's daughter's wedding cake, which at the time was very difficult to do. It's kind of a coming-of-age story, if I remember correctly. I've read it some years ago now, but I remember absolutely loving it. Just a really solid story that will just suck you in. 2009, and this is a Pulitzer Prize winner. This is Tinkers by Paul Harding. I often say that Paul Harding is kind of like the modern day John Steinbeck. This was his debut novel. I actually just listened to an interview with him where he tells the story about finding out about winning the Pulitzer, which was really good. If you go on YouTube, it'll probably come right up. It was fairly recently. It was on some show where a guy frequently interviews writers, but it's got some of the most beautiful writing I've ever read in it. In fact, my favorite passage of any book I've ever read is from this book. It can be a little bit challenging to read at times, but it is quite short, so worth tackling. For 2010, we've got another Vietnam War story. This is Matterhorn by Karl Marlantes. I actually read it this year, in 2025, and it will probably be one of my favorite reads of the year. It's pretty long. It's about 600 pages, but it's an incredibly gripping story, and Karl Marlantes himself actually fought in the Vietnam War. He was a Marine, and so a lot of this book is based on his personal experience, even though it is a work of fiction. I know he's written a couple other books. I think he actually has a nonfiction memoir about his experience in the war, but I have no idea about any of his other works, but this one was fantastic. For 2011, I'm kind of cheating a little bit because this was originally published in 2002, I think in the Paris Review magazine. It wasn't published as its own standalone book until 2011, and it's Train Dreams by Dennis Johnson. I just read this the other day. It's fantastic. I mean, it's quite short. You can read it in a single sitting, and they're making a film adaptation about it soon. I think it comes out actually in September or October of this year, and I wanted to read it before the film came out because it's always better to read the book first. So incredibly different from Tree of Smoke, and I can definitely see that Hemingway comparison in Train Dreams, but effectively it's about this guy his whole life. And then he lives out in the Midwest, West Coast area, and he's kind of an unskilled laborer and doesn't really have much of a family, doesn't really have much of an education. He's born in like the late 1800s. And so it's just about that kind of like lifestyle of living in that time period and that way that a lot of people did, where a lot of people grew up without running water or electricity and just finding different ways to make odds and ends meet. Despite it being short, it is just an incredibly emotionally impactful book and very sad. All right, let's move on to 2012. This is The Anarchist Who Shared My Name by Pablo Martin Sanchez, translated from Spanish by Jeff Diedemann. This is published by Deep Vellum. They're a great indie publisher here in the States. So this is a work of fiction, but it's based on a real person. So this guy, Pablo Martin Sanchez, is a writer. He Googled himself and he found that there was another Pablo Martin Sanchez from Spain that was executed for participating in a attempted coup against the government in the early 1900s. He did a bunch of research about this guy's life and then wrote a story about it. What's very unique about the book is its dual narrative. The whole book is about the former Pablo Martin Sanchez, but there's one narrative that's the storyline of him as an adult and one as a child, and then they kind of flip-flop back and forth until they converge. I almost DNF'd this book pretty late into it. There's a little bit of a dip right around like the 450-ish page mark for about 50 pages. But I was like, man, I'm so close to the end. I'm going to push through. And then like the last 100 pages of this book completely blew my mind. So it's a book I talk about and think about all the time. For 2013, I've got another book that I literally just read for our July book club, and this is Middle Sea by William H. Gass. So 2 Gass novels on this list today. If you're a fan of The Tunnel, Omen Setter's Luck, and The Heart of the Country, you may not love Middle Sea. William Gass was 90 years old when this was published. I'm not exactly sure when he wrote it. It has some features to it that are like staples of Gass's writing, but it is a little bit more, I guess, pedestrian compared to some of his other books. It's a very slow burn. It's a very heavy book. And I feel like I need to reread it because I think there's a lot here that I missed. But overall, I actually did really enjoy this one, even though it's not the type of book that when you're not reading it, it's like calling you to pick it up. But every time I did pick it up and begin to read, I just got really wrapped up in the book itself. 2015 is another Pulitzer Prize winner. This is The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen. This is a very unique book about a North Vietnamese soldier from the Communist Party during the Vietnam War who is acting as a spy undercover, infiltrating the South Vietnamese and, alongside the Americans, and then has to flee to America with the South Vietnamese after the fall of Saigon. It is sad, brutal, funny all at once. Was adapted into an HBO special, which is also quite good. There is a sequel to this, The Committed, I believe, but I've yet to read it. My 2016 pick is another book that I've read recently. This is Minor Detail by Adania Shibli, and this is translated by Elizabeth Jacquet. So this is from New Directions Publishing. They're another great indie publisher here in the States. And I picked this up knowing nothing about it. My podcast co-host, Andy, gave it to me after he read it. It's been sitting on my shelf, and I have some big reads coming up, and I thought I'll just grab the shortest book I have on my shelf and read it. Picked it up, knew nothing about it, was in for a shock. It's written by a Palestinian woman, and it's told in two parts. It's about a war crime by an Israeli soldier in 1949 in the first half of the book, which is told in the third person. And then there's the first person perspective in the second half of the book, which is told in current time. And that is about this woman who is trying to do a little bit more digging about this war crime. It's based on a true story, and the perpetrators of the crime were tried and found guilty, but it was done in a military tribunal court, and it was kept secret, the details of which didn't come out until I think about the early 2000s, when the Israeli publication Haaretz broke the story. It's got some really sparse but haunting writing, and the subject matter is pretty tough. For 2017, we've got Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. This is a multi-generational family saga that starts in the time period where Japan was occupying Korea. And it's really about how that Japanese occupation affected Koreans, and you get an up-close and personal look at it and how it affected this one particular family. And it really shows like the cultural impact on the family level over multiple generations. This is the type of book where you pick it up and you start reading it and you don't want to put it down, and you can usually just like crush a book like this in just a couple days, despite it being over 500 pages long, but a really, really great book. 2018 is China Dream by Ma Jian and translated by Flora Drew from Chinese. This is another satirical work of Chinese literature that is very critical of the Chinese government. In fact, he doesn't live in China anymore because his books have been banned there, and it's really not safe for him to live in China, from what I understand. But this is about somebody that works for the Chinese government, and his job is to effectively erase the memories of the citizens and install new memories in their minds and new dreams in their minds. So everyone in China is living with this unified dream. It's supposed to bring the culture together. But as he's working this job, he's kind of starting to lose his own mind, and he spends a lot of time reflecting about his youth when he was part of the youth groups in the Maoist communist China. And if you're not familiar with what actually happened then, there were a lot of groups of young people that were very, very big supporters of Mao, but they all had their own kind of interpretations on what Maoist communism was supposed to be. And at first, the Communist Party was allowing them to kind of do the dirty work, but then these groups started fighting amongst each other, and it was pretty bad. So that's a lot of that is in this book. This cover art was actually done by an artist that was disappeared by the Chinese government for a while. 2019, this is Natural Causes by Nina Like, translated from Norwegian by B.L. Crook. Yet another book you can go grab from Open Letter and get a discount on it. And this is about a doctor who is pretty late on in her career, been married for quite a long time, and she's starting to feel burnt out both on her job and her marriage. And then she starts to make some pretty poor decisions in her professional and personal life because of that. And the skeleton in her office starts to berate her about some of her decision making. Very human book, very sad and funny at the same time. Okay, we're into the 2020s. We're into this decade. So this is Yellowbird by Sierra Crane Murdoch. This is a nonfiction. If you enjoyed Killers of the Flower Moon, I think you would also really like this book. In fact, I think this was the better book. What's interesting is that these books tell stories that are 100 years apart from Killers of the Flower Moon to this, but effectively about the same thing. This is about an Indian reservation where there's oil discovered, and then that just draws the attention of a lot of people who want to come in and take advantage of the situation, and it leads to missing persons cases, murder, and a whole bunch of other stuff. I would say this is a work of gonzo journalism where the author does eventually kind of get inserted into the story, although a bit unintentionally, but it really added an interesting dynamic to this one. For 2021, I've got Fury by Cleo Mendoza, and this is translated by Christina McSweeney. This is published by Seven Stories Press. They're a great indie publisher. This is about two soldiers on opposing sides of a military conflict, and one of them shoots like a child and kills them, and the two soldiers descend upon the body and then confront each other, and then a weird relationship develops from there, and then from there the story gets really wild. So this is heavily surrealist. It's kind of told in a series of fractured vignettes. As you can see, the pages are quite short. Like a lot of times the chapter is just a single page or a page and a half. And it's one of the most brutal and vulgar books I've ever read. It's a book that makes me want to learn Spanish because it is as good as it is. I bet it's even better in its original language. And I just realized I skipped 2014. I've got Human Acts by Han Kang, originally written in Korean, translated by Deborah Smith. This is a fantastic book. It's very unique in the sense that it has chapters that are told in different perspectives. So there's first person, second person, and third person in here. If you're not familiar with those different styles, obviously first person is like I went to the store, I told them this, I told them that. Third person is they bought the shoes, they went to the mall. Second person is you walked out your front door, you picked the flowers. So it's pretty unique. And here in the States, at least, there's kind of this idea that like North Korea became communist and South Korea became capitalist, and therefore everything in North Korea is terrible and everything in South Korea is great. It's not as clear cut as that, and this is about some serious political strife in South Korea in the 80s based on a true story, very tragic event, and I really enjoyed this. And Han Kang is a Nobel Prize winner, so if you haven't read any of her books, probably worth checking out. 2022's pick might surprise you. It surprised me a little bit, and it's Babel by R.F. Kuang. Now, to be honest, this isn't even my favorite R.F. Kuang book. I thought Yellowface was better, but that came out in 2023, and I have picks from that year that I liked better than this one. But, I have people in my life that have said that this is their favorite book. I don't know about that. I don't know if it's that good, but it is good. And people think that it's a little too heavy-handed. That's just R.F. Kuang's style, in my opinion, and I think it works for her. For 2023, I have yet another Paul Harding novel, and it's This Other Eden. This is his third book. It's about some people in Maine living on an island around the turn of the century, 1800s to 1900s, and they're living a very simple life. They're kind of off the grid, and then a group of white people want to come in and use the land to develop it into like a resort or something like that, and the people living there don't really have the means necessary to push back against that kind of thing. It's a very tragic story, again, in classic Paul Harding style. It's very beautifully written. I didn't love this one as much as Tinker's, but I do think it's excellent. 2 years left, 2024 and 2025, but here's the thing. I've read a few books from these last 2 years, nothing that really wowed me. So instead of just talking about some books that I was kind of about, I would like to turn this around on you. Which books do you think are the best books published in the last 2 years, and which ones should I read? Drop a comment below, make a recommendation, and if I like your recommendation, maybe I'll check them out.